Thank you, Mark, and thanks everybody for joining today. Uh, as was mentioned, I'm Tony Krabill. I'm the treasurer at Greif. Greif is a roughly $6 billion global company. You can see on the map here the countries that we're in. We make steel drums, plastic drums, paper packaging, and other services that go with that. About 12,000 colleagues worldwide, and as you can see, in a number of countries and facilities. And that's kind of Greif in a nutshell.
It sort of, in a way, sort of illustrates some of that, particularly when we talk about, bank connectivity. So, regardless of whether you sit here within the US or you're an organization that trades globally, you have many formats, many banks, many channels, and all the complexity around being able to manage that. So whether you're, a very manual outfit and you're going into each of your bank portals, you're using a token, you're downloading the data from a PDF, and taking that and putting it in an Excel and then sending that centrally to the treasurer or the treasury team somewhere else, and then they're compiling that. There's that effort. And then for other organizations that have are lucky enough to have a large enough IT team to be able to manage all of those different channels, whether it's a host to host or APIs and things like that, it's pretty onerous task, would you think?
Yeah, and you make some good points there about the resources IT, and we'll talk about maybe maturity levels of different treasury departments. You could be a very large company, but not have a great need for treasury complexity.
Yeah.
So if you're a fully domestic company, you could have billions of dollars in revenue, but maybe only have one bank relationship. So it doesn't really apply. But as Mark and I were putting this slide together and talking about it, as you start getting more countries, more complexity, you end up with requiring more and more IT resources if you're not using the most up-to-date solutions. So just simple things like being able to send payments in Italy and Germany and Sweden. For the uninitiated, you might think, well, they're all in Europe. How difficult can this be, right? They're different payment systems and payment types, and it requires different data to be stored in your internal master data file. It gets very complex very quickly, and pretty soon you're managing maybe several dozen different connections, which adds up to a lot of IT time.
Exactly. If you can get them. And in fact, just to give you a little sense of the complexity, if we go to the next slide there, we'll just see, all the types of permutations, that you could get stuck with, the more complex that gets for an organization. So you got a lot of different channels, obviously a lot of different formats in that. Maybe you're managing multiple interfaces between, say, your ERP and your TMS and, your HR system or any other plethora of systems you may have around your organization. Obviously, then within all of that, possibly managing many banks and many accounts.
Yes, agree. This is a good visual representation, not for anyone to digest, but just to get a sense for those who maybe haven't experienced this, of just how complicated it can get very quickly, and can be overwhelming, and can lead treasury departments, I feel like, to step back from a leadership role because it's so complicated. We feel like we don't have the skills to take on such a big challenge.
Yeah, and and I think that's one of the things about the digital age that we live in today, is that fortunately there are more and more systems available in the market today that can help alleviate a lot of those pain points, right? And I've seen charts that are far more complex with far more interfaces littered around the place, where that complexity can be removed, by deploying technology. And technology, I think today is the value adds have increased, but also the price points have got better for companies to be able to deploy some of these things that may have been out of their reach 10, 15 years ago. Now you have more opportunity to actually take advantage of technology and automate a lot of these processes and remove some of the complexity in that process. And again, it gives that treasurer that opportunity to be more strategic to the business and less on the back foot.
Exactly, and I think the price point is a very good point. That when I started doing this many years ago, it was very expensive to be able to put all these pieces together. But that's that democratization
Yeah.
of treasury software and solutions, that some of these things are so standard now. They're even prepackaged or in pretty neat little bundles that you can buy for a pretty reasonable price and make a justification to the business on what value this adds. And I find that has continued, again, exponentially adding value while cost has moderated or even gone down.
So Tony, I'd like to pick up from you. You sort of you alluded to it there a couple of slides ago, but just the idea of a treasury continuum, because not everybody needs a solution for something, right? And what does that look like? I mean, on one end you have companies that may be very small, starting out. Maybe they're a $20 million a year organization, and then on the other end of that spectrum, you have global enterprise, multi-enterprise companies that are trading all over the world. They're worth many, many billions of dollars. Lots of complexity, and over that period of time, presumably they've made acquisitions and they've got multiple ERPs and multiple problems that they've sort of accumulated as they grew. Maybe we'll go to the next slide and we can talk a little about that in terms of our treasury maturity model.
Yeah, and I rather than try to read all these very small words off the page, I'm sure we'll post this somewhere where people can go back and look at it later. But I think people get the point of, when you're looking at how complex the organization is. You have a pretty linear progression from maybe some lagging treasury departments that are really doing things in Excel spreadsheets with manual dongles to be able to log into their banks and to gather that data in maybe multiple formats. Some banks CSV, some banks PDF, and you go and just the basics of treasury, like daily polling and cash positioning, are a major part of what the Treasury Department does. And again, for some Treasury departments, maybe that's all that's needed. As you mentioned, a small company or a very simple company. Progress maybe to achieving and exceeding, where you start to have a need and a desire to deliver more value to the business, where you are getting this data. You don't have time to get data from maybe 3 or 10 different banks in different formats and either manually type it in or convert it with a macro or something like that. Just the exercise of gathering all the data takes so much time.
Yeah.
And maybe you're managing your debt in an Excel spreadsheet and trying to output journal vouchers, all those sorts of things. As you grow up or go up the spectrum, you're moving more toward being Treasury as a strategic partner, adding real value to the organization, as opposed to maybe just an extension of a corporate accounting department, more on the lagging end of the spectrum.
Yeah, and of course, the more from a bank connectivity perspective, which is the world I'm living in these days, the more banks you have. And I know a lot of people talk about APIs, and certainly I think that's the future direction. FinTech 4.0 and beyond. But as we are all aware, APIs, not every bank has an API, and so so if you're one of those companies that has, say, JP Morgan or Citibank, and you're using their APIs, that's a great solution. You can sort of automate that process of bank connectivity, both on the bank balance reporting, but also on the payment side. But as you start to layer on more banks, and invariably that's part of the challenge, I think, for companies in general, is not every bank has an API, and even those banks that have APIs, they're not all the same. And the promise of enriched data is a bit of the ways off, but that's kind of where we'll go for sure. And being able to fill out the gap and automate that across a wider selection of banks, gives more value, I think, to the companies. But it depends on where you are in that continuum and where your needs are.
Yeah, and if we could flip to the next slide. So this was Greif Treasury in 2015. Now, and we've mentioned this before, but it's worth saying again. As always, this is dependent on what your organization needs and wants. But we were clearly a lagging Treasury department. As a global company, we were just not adding value to the organization. We're another corporate function, basically just doing planning and accounting. We were doing more accounting than we were doing Treasury work. and we didn't have the tools to add value. So as you go through here, I mean, we were doing daily cash positioning as Treasury, but only for 3 out of over 40 countries. So is that really Treasury, right? Do you really have control of the cash?
Yeah.
No, you really don't. We were doing a lot of manual payments, and our intercompany loan portfolio was completely manual and took up just an incredible amount of time for what it was, and for what it accomplished. And by the intercompany loan portfolio, I mean also the in-house bank, which we treated as an intercompany loan portfolio. So we were just not efficient with 9 people, 5 of which were in Europe and 4 in the US. So when I came in and took over Treasury, if we could flip the slide here, the problem was, as we stared at this, there was no starting point. And I'm sure you've all experienced this as well. Like everything had dependencies. But I broke it down on this slide into the 5 key issues that we needed to solve. As I mentioned, each had precedents and antecedents, but there was no place to step into the middle. So I won't read off the page, but I'm sure a lot of this sounds familiar to you all if you're trying to kind of climb that maturity curve for Treasury. The key for us that we found to be the starting point was to carve out things we shouldn't be doing or that we were doing poorly to free up time to do the things we should be doing. So the place that we stepped in, and I numbered them where we stepped in, the place where we stepped in was task ownership. So we were doing a lot of low value work, most of which didn't even belong in Treasury. So what we decided we were going to do was we brought in an intern who helped us build a lot of automation, built a lot of used software tools to build a lot of automation that it was one of the best investments we made because it freed up dozens of hours per month across the entire team that we then reallocated to working with our shared service center to say, hey, here's a process that we share and it's not very good. And we think we can do it better. So we redeployed those hours to then fixing that. Well, now we had several things that we'd fixed that freed up even more hours that we then redeployed once again. And it just became a flywheel until we had created enough available space that we could move on. And this kind of overlaps to that number 2 point of poor processes. Now that we had done a favor for our shared service center to say, hey, we've freed up time for you. Now we need you to take this stuff that doesn't belong in Treasury. So that was a much easier discussion because we had created the time for them to be able to do that. Only then could we start to focus on, we knew the end point. The end point was we wanted a treasury management system globally in full control of global cash. So only at that point did we start looking at treasury management systems and how we could get all the data we needed. And from there, now we had the capability, the software and the capability and the connections to do what Treasury is supposed to do. Now we could approach all the country controllers, and I'm sure this resonates with people that there are many organizations worldwide where the country operates as its own island. They control their own processes. They control the cash. Treasury is not welcome. But at that point, we were able to show them, hey, we've got the tools. Let us step in. And I'll show you on the next slide in just a moment how we did that. But let us step in and then again, just build that flywheel. We showed you we could do it here. Now go to the next country. Look back over there. Ask those people. We did it there. Let us do it here too. And so each time we did that, we were able to gain more and more basically friends in the organization who said, wait a minute, I don't have to do this stuff that I don't want to do anymore. You're coming in here to take work away from me, but not take people away from me. You just want to take work and help me. And that's a great conversation to have, just like our shared service center. So at that point, we progressed to that global control of cash that is our target. So if we flip the page, at this point, again, I won't abuse you all by reading off the page, but just very quickly, this is the summary of how we did that, starting in North America, built in our North America shared service center, moving to Mexico, using Mexico as our use case, moving from Mexico throughout Latin America, which were smaller bites to take, moving from there to Europe, where we were able to then display our capabilities by saying, hey, ask the folks in Latin America. And it built upon itself at that point. But the hardest part was getting the first step done and stepping in. And it did require some people to work some extra hours and some long and hard hours, but with a payoff at the end. So again, I don't want to abuse you by reading through all the nitty gritty details. But if we flip to the next slide, then this is what Treasury looks like today. So we're now 7 people, but that's not because of cost cutting. That's because we actually got so good at what we do that I went to our CFO and said, I just don't need the people anymore. And over the course of those 5 years, first one and then a second person, as they left the company, we just looked at it and said, we don't even need it. But if you look, 80% of our time has been reallocated to value added activities. And I said 5 years, I meant 7 years. But now we're doing really fun stuff, right?
Yeah.
We're not spending hours and hours doing cash positioning or accounting or intercompany loans. We're doing more interesting things. So in order to do that, to kind of tie this back to the key message here, we couldn't, first we had, as I mentioned, to build that flywheel, but then we had to have the tools. And we just couldn't build these tools ourselves. They would have been too expensive. It would have been too hard to ask our IT group to build all these SFTP connections. So in our case, we used a data aggregator. We used Fides and a treasury management system, GTreasury. The data just flows in, and it flows in with us having to do very little to no work, which again is one of those parts of the flywheel that freed us up to use the data and instead of spending all of our time getting the data. So I said a lot there. Mark, do you have other points you want to hit on that?
Yeah, no, I mean, I think you sort of beautifully illustrated when you take on these, they seem very daunting. It's a very sort of McKinsey-like approach, right? How can I revolutionize the Treasury Department and free up resources and reallocate them into more value adds, higher value, rather than pushing buttons and pulling levers, to borrow a term. But I think you did it in a very smart way, which is building that consensus. Picking an area to work on, but part of that consensus building is also showing those departments that, hey, we're not taking control away necessarily. If anything, we're getting, as a HQ, we're getting greater visibility across my organization. But at the same time, you're giving them some tools for them to be able to automate and do their jobs in those regions, in a better way.
Exactly. It not only gave them more tools to do what they need to do, but it released them from a bunch of things they didn't want to do. We're a global packaging company. These country managers don't want to sit there and approve AP every day, but their processes between Treasury and our shared service center were not good. So they end up spending hours approving AP files. And so it took a lot of working with our shared service center and our IT folks to bring them the tools to show them this isn't to just take control away from you. This is to allow you to go make more steel drums. Spend your day figuring out how to sell more drums instead of how you're going to get your accounts payable or payroll file to the bank. That's the goal.
Yeah. And I think there's, more broadly speaking, if you think, what's the next 10, 15 years look like? Well, gosh, if you want to hire, the next generation of treasurers and finance folks, if you're not deploying the modern technology and doing things like this, it's going to be very hard to bring those people on board, because that's like saying, hey, let's go back to the dust prompt. We work with, mainframe machine, people, younger folks today, I think, are looking for that. They're the ones that want that user experience and have an expectation, a high expectation that technology will solve a lot of these things and make their workday easier, but also give them then the opportunity to be more strategically minded and, more higher value to the companies.
Yeah, that's such a great point. The last 2 people I've hired in Treasury each came to me leaving their old company because they said their old company was just sitting there doing the same process all day long. All they were doing was downloading bank files and making wires and that sort of thing. And when I told them, here's what I'm doing over the next 5 years, they leapt at the opportunity to join the company.
Yeah, excellent point.
It was surprising to me when I first started working with Fides just how many banks could be connected very easily. So you sign some papers with your banks that give them the right to start feeding this data to Fides or another treasury aggregator, of course. But all of a sudden, when we turned on our treasury management system, we had multiple banks reporting that day. Like
Right.
there was not 3 months of testing and everything. It was already there. We were already
Right.
seeing the daily bank statements come through.
One sort of odd quick question to that is, do I need a TMS to work with Fides? No is the quick answer to that. I think for companies on that continuum that are that need a TMS to manage their operations, we obviously make those connections in there. But interestingly enough, we do offer a way to manage centrally all that cash and liquidity and payments for smaller companies, like you talked about on the continuum earlier. That maybe they're not ready yet for a TMS, but we're a sort of an interim step or a treasury light to get there. When you're ready for deploying a system like GTreasury, you can still automate a lot of that bank statements and payments workflow. So there are plenty of options in the markets. And but Tony, I'd like to thank you for your time and sharing Greif's experience and your own experience in building out a treasury. It's very exciting to see change and also to see somebody like yourself actually deploy technology to achieve their goals.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone, for having me and for tuning in to the discussion today.